HyperSensory-Motofixation, a new framework for understanding sensory fixation, self-regulation, and the neuroscience of the digital age by William Cormier. A note on the framework: this book presents clinical observations and a theoretical framework developed through direct practice as a registered behavior technician and graduate-level study in clinical mental health counseling at Liberty University. The construct of hypersensory-motofixation, HSM, and the induced transient neurodivergent-like state, ITNLS, hypothesis are offered as practitioner observations grounded in established neuroscience, not as peer-reviewed empirical findings. The neuroscience cited throughout this book, visual processing pathways, autonomic regulation, sensory processing models, represents established literature. The application of that science to the specific behavioral pattern I call HSM is my own, and it awaits the formal empirical validation that my graduate dissertation and subsequent research will provide. This book is an invitation. It invites clinicians to look for HSM in their own caseloads. It invites researchers to test the hypotheses presented here. It invites parents and educators to consider the sensory processing dimension of behaviors they may already be observing. And it invites the scientific community to engage with a construct that I believe captures something real, something measurable, and something that matters. I welcome collaboration, critique, and correspondence from anyone who recognizes these patterns in their own work. Chapter 1. Before I had the words "for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." 1 Corinthians 13:12. I have been watching this phenomenon my entire life. I just did not know it until I was standing in a room with a 6-year-old boy and a box fan. But before I tell you about that boy, I need to tell you about Richard and Larry. Because the truth is, this book did not begin in a clinical setting. It began in a living room in the 1980s, with two men who never knew they were teaching me anything at all: Richard and Larry. Richard and Larry were my uncles. Both of them had an intellectual disability. Growing up, they were a constant presence in my world, and the way I understood them was shaped entirely by the era we lived in. This was the 1980s and early 1990s, a time when the Western world had very little understanding of what autism actually was. The term existed in clinical literature, but it had not entered the public vocabulary in any meaningful way. There was no spectrum language. There were no awareness campaigns. There were no online resources explaining stimming or sensory processing or self-regulation. If someone in your family had an intellectual disability, you loved them, you took care of them, and you did your best with whatever understanding was available, which in most cases was not much. My grandmother raised Richard and Larry. She was their anchor, their advocate, and their daily world. When she passed away in 1991, our family adopted them. They became part of our household in a way that was deeper and more immediate than the relationship I had known before. They were no longer my uncles who I visited. They were my uncles who lived with us, who were present at every meal, every evening, every ordinary moment of family life. And that proximity is what gave me a front row seat to something I would not be able to name for another 3 decades. Richard had a relationship with television that was unlike anyone else I have ever known. He did not watch TV the way the rest of us did. He was not following plots or waiting to find out what happened next in a story. But he was not just staring blankly at a screen either. Richard followed characters. He locked onto specific people on the screen and studied them with an intensity that went far beyond casual viewing. His deepest attachment was to Bob Barker. The Price is Right came on CBS every weekday, and for Richard it was the center of the day. He did not just watch Bob Barker. He became Bob Barker. He imitated every move the man made. The way Barker walked across the stage, the way he gestured toward the showcase, the way he leaned into the microphone and addressed the audience with that smooth, measured cadence. Richard absorbed all of it and reproduced it with a precision that was startling. He matched the inflection in Barker's voice. He mirrored his facial expressions. He adopted his posture and his timing. If you walked into the room while Richard was watching The Price is Right, you were not watching a man watching television. You were watching a man inhabiting another person's movements, expressions, and vocal patterns in real time. At the time, nobody in our family had a word for what Richard was doing. We thought it was charming. We thought it was funny. We told the story at family gatherings because it was a good story. But looking back now, with the clinical and neuroscientific understanding I have developed over the past decade, I can see layers in that behavior that were invisible to all of us at the time. Richard was not simply imitating a television personality. He was engaging in a complex sensory-motor mirroring behavior that involved sustained visual attention, real-time motor replication, vocal prosody matching, and emotional attunement to a moving visual stimulus. The character on the screen was providing him with a rich, multi-channel sensory template, and his nervous system was using that template as an organizational anchor. When he was locked into Bob Barker, Richard was regulated. He was focused. He was calm and purposeful in a way that he often was not during other parts of the day when his sensory environment was less structured. But there was another behavior that, in hindsight, speaks even more directly to what I would eventually call hypersensory-motofixation. Richard loved VHS tapes, not the movies on them necessarily, the tapes themselves. He would sit with a VCR remote and rewind and fast-forward through content for extended periods. He was not searching for a particular scene or trying to get to a specific part of a movie. He was watching the visual distortion that happens when you shuttle a VHS tape at high speed. The warped, streaking images. The horizontal lines tearing across the screen. The way the picture collapsed into a blur of motion and color when the tape moved fast enough, and the way it resolved back into recognizable images when he let it play at normal speed. He did this over and over, rewinding and fast-forwarding, sometimes for so long that the black tape would unspool from its casing and come spilling out of the cassette. He destroyed tapes doing this, and he did not care, because the tape was never the point. The visual experience of velocity-controlled motion on the screen was the point. He was creating his own stream of high-speed, high-contrast visual stimulation and modulating it with a remote control, adjusting the speed and the direction based on something internal that none of us could see but that his nervous system clearly understood. I watched Richard do this hundreds of times as a child. I never thought twice about it. It was just something Richard did. It was just one of his things. 30 years later, I would watch a 6-year-old boy named E do essentially the same thing with a tablet and a fast-forward button, and the recognition would hit me like a door swinging open. Larry. If Richard's world was organized around the television screen, Larry's world was organized around rhythm and motion in the physical environment. Larry had a deep love for Cajun music. This was not background listening. It was not ambient sound that he tolerated while doing other things. Cajun music was the center of Larry's sensory world in the same way that Bob Barker was the center of Richard. Larry would sit in front of a handheld radio, one of those old portable models with a telescoping antenna, and he would listen for hours at a stretch. Not restlessly, not impatiently. He would sit and he would rock. The rocking was rhythmic, steady, and synchronized to the music. His body moved with the beat in a way that was not dancing, not in the way most people would use that word, but was something more fundamental than dancing. It was his entire body responding to an auditory rhythm and translating it into vestibular motion. Back and forth for as long as the music played. His eyes would close or go soft. His breathing would settle into the tempo. His facial muscles would relax. The rocking was not a sign of agitation. It was the opposite. It was where Larry went to be at peace. And then there was the potato masher. Larry had an old-fashioned metal potato masher, the kind with a heavy zigzag wire head and a wooden or metal handle. And he would hold it while he listened to his music and twirl it. He spun it in his fingers, rotated it, flipped it, turned it over and over in his hands with a dexterity that seemed at odds with his other motor capabilities. The twirling was continuous and rhythmic, synchronized loosely to the music and to his rocking, creating a three-channel sensory experience. Auditory rhythm from the radio, vestibular input from the rocking, and proprioceptive and visual stimulation from the spinning object in his hands. Nobody told Larry to do this. Nobody taught him. He found his way to this particular combination of sensory inputs on his own, and he returned to it day after day, year after year, because it worked. It brought his nervous system to a place that nothing else in his environment could reach. The Cajun music, the rocking, the twirling masher. Three streams of rhythmic, repetitive sensory input converging on a single nervous system and producing a state of deep, sustained calm. I sat in the same room with Larry while he did this more times than I can count. I was a kid. I did not analyze it. I did not see it as data, but I absorbed it. The image of Larry in his chair, rocking to the radio, twirling that old potato masher, is one of the most vivid sensory memories of my childhood. And it is one of the images that returns to me now, decades later, every time I watch a child in a clinical setting find their own version of the same thing. What I could not see then, Richard rewinding VHS tapes until the ribbon came spilling out. Larry rocking in his chair with a potato masher spinning in his fingers. Two men in the same household, both with intellectual disabilities, both living in an era that had almost no framework for understanding what their nervous systems were doing, and both finding their own pathways to sensory regulation through repetitive, rhythmic, velocity-driven stimulation. Richard's pathway was visual. He controlled the speed of visual input on a screen, shuttling images back and forth at velocities he chose, watching the blur and the resolution, the acceleration and the deceleration. His behavior was, in every functional sense, identical to what I would later observe in a 6-year-old boy fast-forwarding through videos on a tablet. The technology was different. The mechanism was the same. Larry's pathway was multisensory. He layered auditory rhythm, vestibular motion, and proprioceptive visual stimulation from a spinning object into a self-constructed regulatory system that he maintained for hours at a time. Neither of them had a diagnosis that captured what they were doing. Neither of them had a clinician in their life who could have looked at these behaviors and said, "This is not random. This is not meaningless. This is a nervous system doing exactly what it needs to do to stay regulated in a world that is not providing the right input on its own." I could not see any of that then. I was a child. I loved my uncles. I watched them do what they did, and I carried those images with me into adulthood without knowing that they were preparing me to see something that the rest of the clinical world had not yet named. It would take 3 decades, a career in applied behavior analysis, a graduate program in clinical mental health, a growing passion for neuroscience, and a boy sitting at a table staring at a box fan before everything I had been unconsciously absorbing since childhood finally came together into a single clear thought. I have seen this before. I have been seeing it my whole life, and it needs a name. Chapter 2. The fan in the room. The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. Robertson Davies. 30 years after watching Richard lean into the glow of a fast-moving television screen, I was standing in a different room, in a different decade, watching a different person do something remarkably similar. Only this time, I had the training to understand what I was seeing. The boy was 6 years old. For the purposes of this book, I will call him E. I was running a session with him in a home-based ABA setting. He was seated at a small table, working through a set of task demands that were well within his ability level. The room was quiet. The materials were familiar. There was nothing in the environment that should have pulled his attention away from the work in front of him, but something did. There was a box fan in the corner of the room. It was running on a low setting, just moving air. Nobody had given it a second thought, but E was not treating it like background. He was watching it, not glancing, locked on. His eyes were fixed on the blades, and his body had gone still in a way that did not match the restlessness I had seen from him just minutes earlier. My first instinct was to redirect. That is what you are trained to do as an RBT. The task is on the table. The reinforcer is contingent on task completion. If the child is off task, you prompt, you redirect, you get them back. And I did. He came back to the task, finished a few items, and then his eyes drifted right back to the fan. This happened 4 or 5 times in the span of a few minutes, and somewhere around the fourth time I stopped myself. Something about the pattern felt different from ordinary distraction, and something about it felt familiar, not from my clinical training, from my childhood, from Richard, from Larry. So I stopped redirecting and I watched. What I saw over the next several minutes changed the trajectory of my clinical thinking. E was not watching the fan in a general sense. He was watching the blades. Specifically, he was attending to changes in blade speed. When the fan cycled or when someone adjusted the setting, there was a moment where the blades would accelerate from a slower rotation to a faster one, and during that transition, E's attention sharpened visibly. His eyes tracked the individual blades as they picked up speed and blurred together. During those moments, E's entire physiological presentation shifted. His breathing slowed. The tension in his shoulders softened. His facial expression relaxed. He was not just looking at the fan. Something about the act of watching those blades change speed was calming him down. This was not a simple case of visual stimming or stereotype fixation on a spinning object. Something more specific was happening. His nervous system appeared to be using the visual input of velocity change as a tool for regulation, and he was doing it without any instruction, without any prompting, and almost certainly without any conscious awareness of what he was accomplishing. The tablet, the fan, was the first piece of the clinical puzzle. The second came from a tablet. E had access to a tablet during certain parts of his day, and I began to notice a parallel pattern. He gravitated toward content that was fast-moving, high in contrast, and dense with visual transitions. The subject matter seemed almost irrelevant. He was not following narratives or engaging with characters. He was watching motion. The most revealing behavior was what he did with playback speed. E had figured out, at 6 years old, how to fast-forward through video content using touchscreen gestures. He was not navigating to a destination. He was creating one. By pressing and holding the screen to accelerate the video, he was generating a self-controlled stream of rapid visual stimulation that he modulated in real time based on what his nervous system needed in that moment. The parallel to the fan was unmistakable. In both cases, he was attending to velocity transitions. In both cases, his body calmed down while he did it. I started documenting what I saw. The picture that emerged was clear and consistent. These behaviors were not competing with his ability to function. They were supporting it. That realization led to a clinical decision. We integrated a tablet with high-contrast videos into E's workspace as a structured accommodation. The results were measurable. Task engagement went up. Maladaptive behaviors during work periods went down. He was calmer, more available for learning, and less likely to escalate when demands increased. We were not rewarding off-task behavior. We were meeting a sensory need that, once met, freed him to do the work we were asking of him. Chapter 3. The little girl, the countless others, and the pattern that would not stay quiet once you notice something. You cannot unnotice it. That is both the gift and the burden of observation. William Cormier, if E was the case that made me see the pattern clearly, there was a second child who made me certain it was real. Several months after I first documented E's behaviors, I began working with a 2.5-year-old girl I will call M. She was bright, active, with an intense emotional range. When she was happy, she was radiant. When she was distressed, she was inconsolable. What I noticed was her relationship with screens. At 2.5, she did not have the motor skills to manipulate playback speed the way E did, but she had found her own way to get what her nervous system seemed to need. She gravitated immediately toward content with fast-moving, high-contrast visuals, and would hold the screen close to her face, tracking the movement with a focus that seemed well beyond her developmental stage. The regulatory effect was the same as what I had seen with E, only more dramatic because of her age and emotional intensity. When M was distressed, the introduction of fast-moving digital content produced a visible shift. Her crying would slow. Her breathing would deepen. The rigidity in her small body would ease. She was not being entertained. She was being regulated. Slow-paced content designed for toddlers produced no regulatory benefit. She would fuss, push the tablet away, or ignore it. But when the visual packing increased, she locked in. Her nervous system responded to the velocity and intensity of the visual input in a way that slower content could not replicate. The countless others, E and M, are the cases I describe in detail because they were the clearest and most formative. But they were not the only ones. Over the course of my work as an RBT, I have seen this pattern more times than I can count. It presents differently depending on the child, the setting, the developmental level, and the available stimuli, but the core features are remarkably consistent. A child orients toward visual motion. The motion is central, not incidental. The child's body responds in ways that suggest autonomic regulation, and the behavior persists, returns, and intensifies under conditions of arousal, distress, or environmental understimulation. I have seen it in children who watch ceiling fans with the same patient intensity that E brought to the box fan. I have seen it in children who hold tablets inches from their faces and will not accept any content below a certain threshold of visual speed and contrast. I have seen it in children who rock or sway while watching fast-moving content, layering vestibular input on top of the visual stimulation. By the time I sat down to formalize the construct, I was not working from 2 data points. I was working from a pattern witnessed across dozens of sessions, multiple children, and different developmental profiles. Chapter 4, where 3 roads meet. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. Marcel Proust. People sometimes ask me how I ended up working at the intersection of applied behavior analysis, clinical mental health, and neuroscience. The honest answer is that I did not plan it that way. It emerged from a combination of training, instinct, and the stubborn feeling that the answers I was getting from any one discipline were not complete. I came to this work through ABA. My certification as a registered behavior technician gave me a framework grounded in observation, measurement, and functional analysis. ABA teaches you to look at what a person does, identify what happens before and after the behavior, and determine what function the behavior serves. For a certain class of questions, it is extraordinarily effective, but ABA focuses on the observable. When I started seeing children whose behaviors involved a complex interplay between sensory input, neurological processing, and emotional regulation, I wanted to understand what was happening inside their nervous systems, not just at the surface. That led me to the clinical mental health counseling program at Liberty University, which opened a second lens, one that takes seriously the internal world of the client. The third lens, neuroscience, was a direction I pursued on my own because the questions I was asking demanded it. When I watched the physiological shifts described in Chapter 2, I wanted to know what was happening at the level of the visual cortex and the autonomic nervous system. When I thought about Richard and Larry, I wanted to understand what had been happening in their nervous systems all those years ago. The behavioral lens, applied behavior analysis, gave me the discipline of looking at function before form. When I applied that lens to the behaviors described in Chapter 2, the picture that emerged was not distraction. It was regulation. The behavior was not competing with E's ability to do the work. It was supporting it. That insight came from the most fundamental question in ABA. What is the function? The clinical lens. If ABA taught me to ask what the behavior does, clinical mental health training taught me to ask what the person experiences. E could not describe his internal state with clinical precision, but his body told me. M had even fewer words, but her emotional world was enormous and written across every surface of her being. Clinical training taught me that those physiological shifts are data, not background noise, the neuroscience lens. The third perspective came from a question that neither ABA nor clinical counseling could fully answer on its own. What is happening in the brain when a person watches motion change speed and calms down? The established neuroscience of visual processing, autonomic regulation, and sensory integration provided the framework I needed. The chapters that follow lay out that science in detail. This is where the three roads meet. ABA tells me the behavior has a function. Clinical mental health tells me the person is experiencing a shift in emotional and physiological state, and neuroscience tells me why. Each lens alone gives a partial picture. Together, they give me hypersensory-motofixation. Chapter 5. Naming what I saw until we have a name for something, we often fail to notice it. Adapted from Wittgenstein, I want to be honest about what it feels like to propose a new term in science. It feels presumptuous. There is a voice in the back of your mind that says, who are you to name something? You are a graduate student. You are an RBT. I have listened to that voice, and I have taken it seriously. I have asked myself whether the existing literature already contains a term that captures what I observed. I have looked for the construct that would make a new term unnecessary, and I have not found it. Sensory seeking is a well-established construct. So is visual stimming. So is attentional capture. So is hyperfocus. Each does important work within its own framework. But none describes, with the specificity I need, a pattern defined by all 5 of the following features simultaneously. The modality is visual. The stimulus type is motion with velocity variation. The quality of attention is sustained, preferential, and fixated. The function is autonomic and emotional regulation, and the intensity threshold is elevated. Building the term, piece of the name carries weight. Hyper. This prefix signals that the sensory engagement is not at a typical or baseline level. The individual requires elevated intensity, whether that means faster motion, sharper contrast, or more dramatic velocity transitions. Sensory. This identifies the domain. HyperSensory-Motofixation, HSM, is a sensory processing phenomenon involving the intake, filtering, and utilization of sensory information for regulatory purposes. Modo. This is the element that gives the term its specificity. The sensory input is not static. It is motion, and more precisely, variable motion. The velocity change dimension is the defining feature that distinguishes HSM from other forms of visual sensory seeking. Fixation. This describes the attentional quality. The individual locks on. The attention is sustained, preferential, and functionally significant. From living room to literature, when I look back across the full arc, from Richard and Larry in the 1980s to the clinical observations described in chapters 2 and 3, I see a single phenomenon expressed across different bodies, different decades, and different levels of clinical understanding. The technology changes. The mechanism does not. Proposing a new term is not the end of a process. It is the beginning. A term without evidence is just a word. A term with evidence is a tool. My responsibility, having put this name forward, is to do the work that turns it from one into the other. That work begins with this book, continues with my graduate dissertation at Liberty University, and extends into a broader research agenda that I hope will invite collaboration across disciplines. The chapters that follow lay out the science. Part 2, the science building the framework. Chapter 6, how the brain sees motion. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Proverbs 20:12. Note, all cited neuroscience in this chapter, and those that follow is established literature. HSM-specific empirical data are preliminary clinical observations pending formal dissertation research. Before we can understand why a child calms down while watching spinning blades change speed, why a toddler settles when fast-moving images fill her screen, or why an adult cannot look away from rain streaking across a window, we need to understand how the brain processes visual motion. The neuroscience here is well established. What has been missing is the clinical application of that science to the kinds of regulatory behaviors that define hypersensory-motofixation, HSM. The visual processing pipeline. In plain terms, the brain does not just see. It processes what it sees through a series of specialized relay stations, each adding a layer of interpretation. Here is how that pipeline works for motion. Vision begins at the retina, where photoreceptor cells convert light into electrical signals. These signals travel through the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate nucleus (LGN), a thalamic relay station that sorts and organizes visual information before passing it to the primary visual cortex, known as V1, in the occipital lobe, Hubel and Wiesel, 1962. From V1, visual information diverges into two major processing streams. The ventral stream flows into the temporal lobe and specializes in object recognition, face identification, and color processing, Goodell and Milner, 1992. The dorsal stream flows into the parietal lobe and specializes in processing motion, spatial relationships, depth perception, and the temporal dynamics of visual input, Miss Kin, 1983. For understanding HSM, the dorsal stream is central. Within the dorsal stream, a region called area MT, also designated V5, contains neurons specifically tuned to detect motion direction and speed. These cells are remarkably sensitive to changes in velocity, Monsell and Van Essen, 1983. Adjacent area, MSD, integrates motion signals across larger portions of the visual field, processing optic flow patterns, Bourne and Bradley, 2005. The kind of whole-field visual motion experienced when scrolling through a video feed, watching highway traffic from an overpass, or tracking the tumble of clothes in a dryer. Why movement captures attention, the brain's prioritization of motion, is an evolutionary inheritance. For most of human history, detecting movement in the visual environment was critical for survival. The organisms that detected motion quickly and accurately survived. As a result, the human visual system is hardwired to treat moving stimuli as high priority, Theus, 2010. This prioritization operates through both cortical and subcortical pathways. The superior colliculus, a midbrain structure receiving direct retinal input, can orient gaze and attention toward moving stimuli faster than the cortical visual pathway can complete its analysis, Crosley's, 2013. This reflexive orienting system is what makes you turn your head when something moves in your peripheral vision before you even know what it is. For most people, this attentional capture is transient. But the depth and duration of motion-induced attentional capture vary across individuals and are influenced by neurological threshold, developmental stage, and the specific properties of the motion stimulus. Individuals with elevated sensory thresholds may experience motion-induced attentional capture that is deeper, more sustained, and more resistant to voluntary disengagement. There is another reflexive system worth considering here, the optokinetic reflex, or OKR. The OKR is an involuntary eye movement response triggered by large-field visual motion, such as watching a landscape scroll past a train window or tracking the rotation of a patterned drum in a laboratory setting. Cohen, 2004. The reflex produces a characteristic pattern called optokinetic nystagmus, a rhythmic cycle of slow tracking eye movements followed by rapid resets. The OKR is closely integrated with the vestibular system, and its activation has been shown to modulate vestibular-ocular processing and arousal state. When I think about what he was doing as he tracked rotating blades accelerating and decelerating, I wonder whether part of what his nervous system was seeking was a specific activation and reset cycle of the optokinetic reflex, a rhythmic engagement of the vestibular-ocular system that produced its own form of sensory regulation independent of, or in addition to, the cortical motion processing pathway described above. This is speculative, but it opens a line of investigation that future research could address through eye-tracking studies measuring nystagmus patterns during HSM engagement. Speed changes and neural adaptation. Here is a key principle that helps explain why the velocity transitions matter so much. The brain is fundamentally a change detection organ. Neurons throughout the cortex respond most vigorously to changes in their input, a principle called neural adaptation. Grill-Spector, 2006. A neuron that fires strongly when a stimulus first appears will gradually reduce its firing rate if the stimulus remains constant. But if the stimulus changes, the neuron responds again at full strength. Applied to visual motion, this means that a ceiling fan spinning at a constant speed, a washing machine running at a fixed cycle, or a screensaver drifting at a uniform pace are all stimuli to which motion-sensitive neurons will gradually habituate. But any of these stimuli changing speed, an escalator starting up, a car accelerating through an intersection, a washing machine transitioning between cycles, presents a continuously changing stimulus that reactivates the motion detection circuitry with each velocity shift. Monsell and Van Essen, 1983. This is why the velocity transitions appear to be the critical feature of HSM, not motion itself. The transitions are what prevent neural adaptation, what keep the motion processing circuits actively engaged, and what, through downstream connections to autonomic regulatory centers, may sustain the calming process. The magnocellular pathway and temporal processing, the visual system, processes information through two parallel channels that begin at the retina itself. The parvocellular pathway carries high-resolution color and detail information at relatively slow speeds. The magnocellular pathway carries information about contrast, motion, and temporal change at high speed, but with lower spatial resolution. Livingstone and Hubel, 1988. The magnocellular pathway feeds preferentially into the dorsal stream and area MT. It is optimized for detecting rapid temporal changes in the visual field, exactly the kind of input that characterizes HSM stimuli. The strobing flicker of windshield wipers in rain, the blur-to-resolution transition of a spinning object slowing down, the stroboscopic effect of fast-forwarded video, the rapid scene changes of short-form content. Research in developmental neuroscience has shown that the magnocellular pathway matures on a different timeline than the parvocellular pathway, with implications for how children at different ages process motion. Braddock, 2003. This is relevant to the observation that M, at 2.5, responded to fast-moving visual content with a regulatory intensity that seemed disproportionate to her age. Her magnocellular system was online and responsive. Her cortical regulatory systems were still maturing. It is worth noting that the magnocellular contribution to visual processing can be measured objectively using a technique called steady-state visual evoked potentials, or SSVEPs, Norsha, 2015. SSVEPs are EEG-based measurements of the brain's electrical response to rhythmic visual stimulation at specific frequencies. Because the magnocellular pathway is specialized for processing rapid temporal changes, SSVEP paradigms that use high-frequency flickering stimuli can isolate the magnocellular contribution and reveal individual differences in how strongly a person's visual system responds to rapid motion. Research in ASD populations has used SSVEPs to document atypical temporal processing profiles. Milne et al., 2009, and this methodology offers a direct, non-invasive way to test whether individuals who demonstrate HSM show a distinctive magnocellular response signature. I discuss this further in Chapter 15 as a priority for future research. Chapter 7. The Regulation Engine. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. Psalm 139. 14. Understanding how the brain processes visual motion is necessary but not sufficient. The question that defines hypersensory-motofixation, HSM, is not just what the brain sees but how what the brain sees changes how the body feels. This chapter traces the neural pathways that connect visual processing to autonomic regulation. The autonomic nervous system. Beyond fight or flight, the autonomic nervous system, ANS, governs the body's involuntary functions: heart rate, respiration, digestion, pupil dilation, and the constellation of physiological responses associated with stress and recovery. Its two primary branches, the sympathetic activating and parasympathetic calming divisions, work in dynamic opposition to maintain homeostasis. Porges, 2011. The ANS does not operate in a sensory vacuum. Every sensory channel provides input that modulates autonomic tone. Visual information, after cortical processing, feeds into hypothalamic nuclei, the amygdala and brainstem centers including the nucleus tractus solitarius and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, all of which directly regulate autonomic output. Critchley and Harrison, 2013. This means visual stimulation can alter heart rate, respiratory rhythm, and sympathetic-parasympathetic balance without any conscious effort. From eyes to calm. A proposed pathway, the specific pathway by which visual motion processing may produce autonomic calming in HSM, likely involves several interconnected mechanisms, though it is important to note that this pathway has not been directly demonstrated for HSM and remains a hypothesis informed by established neuroscience. First, sustained engagement of the dorsal visual stream and area MT during velocity variable visual fixation appears to generate tonic neural activity in the posterior parietal cortex. This tonic activity may support a state of focused, externally directed attention that suppresses competing internal signals, including the worry and rumination associated with default mode network activity. Rachel, 2015. Second, the rhythmic quality of the visual input, whether from cyclical mechanical rotation, the pulse of traffic passing a window, or repetitive video content, may entrain cortical oscillations. Neural entrainment is a well-documented phenomenon in which rhythmic external stimulation synchronizes the brain's intrinsic oscillatory activity. Mathewson et al., 2012. Research has demonstrated that visual flicker at specific frequencies can modulate alpha and theta band oscillations, with downstream effects on arousal and attentional state. Third, predictable visual motion may function as what Stephen Porges, 2011, calls a neurospective safety cue. Porges' concept of neurosption describes the nervous system's unconscious scanning of the environment for indicators of safety or threat. Rhythmic, predictable motion in the visual field may signal environmental stability to subcortical threat detection systems, promoting a shift away from defensive sympathetic activation and toward ventral vagal calm. This would help explain why the apparent regulatory effect of HSM is so rapid. The neurospective pathway bypasses cortical processing entirely. A fourth mechanism deserves consideration, and it involves a distinction that is easy to overlook. When we discuss digital media engagement later in this book, the role of dopamine in driving seeking behavior will be central. But the calming effect observed during HSM, the slowed breathing, the relaxed jaw, the settled posture, may involve a different neurochemical system entirely. Berridge and Robinson, 2016, have distinguished between the wanting phase of reward, driven by mesolimbic dopamine, and the liking or consummatory phase, mediated in part by the endogenous opioid system, and in some contexts by oxytocin. The physiological calming I observed in E&M looks more like consummation than seeking. It looks like a nervous system that has found what it needs and is settling into the satisfaction of having it. If this interpretation is correct, then the regulatory dimension of HSM may be mediated less by dopaminergic circuits and more by endogenous opioid and oxytocin pathways associated with comfort, satiation, and autonomic quieting. This distinction has implications for how we understand the difference between the compulsive scrolling behavior described in Chapter 10, which appears to be dopamine-driven, and the calming fixation that characterizes HSM, which may involve a different neurochemical signature. Future research incorporating opioid receptor imaging or salivary oxytocin measurement during HSM episodes could help clarify this distinction. Dunn's sensory processing model. Winnie Dunn's, 1997, 2014, model of sensory processing provides a clinical framework for understanding why some individuals require more intense sensory input to achieve regulatory balance. The model maps individuals along two axes, Neurological Threshold and Behavioral Response Strategy. HSM behaviors align with the sensation-seeking quadrant. Individuals with high neurological thresholds who actively pursue intense sensory experiences because their nervous systems require more input to reach optimal arousal. Brown and Dunn, 2002. This framework helps explain why ambient environmental stimulation appears insufficient for these individuals. A normally lit room with ordinary background motion does not produce enough activation in their visual motion processing pathways to trigger the downstream autonomic calming effect. They need more intensity, more speed, more contrast, more velocity variation. Heart rate variability as a potential biomarker. Heart rate variability, HRV, the beat-to-beat variation in cardiac rhythm, is one of the most reliable physiological indicators of autonomic regulatory capacity. Thayer and Lane, 2000. High HRV indicates flexible, responsive autonomic regulation with strong vagal tone. Low HRV indicates a more rigid, less adaptive system. HRV measurement offers a promising objective biomarker for future HSM research. If the hypothesis that visual motion fixation supports parasympathetic activation is correct, then HRV should increase during periods of HSM engagement and decrease when the visual stimulus is removed. Preliminary clinical observations are consistent with this prediction, but formal HRV measurement during HSM episodes has not yet been conducted and represents a priority for the empirical research outlined in Chapter 15. Chapter 8. The Spectrum Next Door. Before I formed you in the womb I knew you, and before you were born I consecrated you. Jeremiah 1:5. The behaviors that define hypersensory-motofixation, HSM, bear meaningful resemblance to the restricted and repetitive behaviors documented in autism spectrum disorder. This chapter examines that resemblance with scientific precision, drawing on the ASD research literature, while maintaining a clear distinction between a behavioral construct and a neurodevelopmental diagnosis. Restricted and repetitive behaviors. The DSM-5-TR framework. The DSM-5-TR, American Psychiatric Association, 2022, identifies restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as a core diagnostic domain of ASD. The manual specifies 4 subcategories, including hyper or hyperreactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. This recognition places visual motion fixation within the diagnostic framework, but provides no further specificity about what types of motion are most salient, whether velocity variation plays a distinctive role, or whether the fixation serves a regulatory function. Visual processing in ASD. What the research shows. Eye tracking studies have consistently demonstrated that autistic individuals show atypical gaze patterns, prolonged fixation on moving stimuli, preferential attention to geometric and mechanical motion over biological motion, Pierce, 2011, and reduced spontaneous attention to social stimuli such as faces and eyes. Research on motion perception in ASD has reported enhanced local motion processing, meaning superior detection of fine-grained motion within small regions of the visual field, alongside reduced global motion coherence, Matron, 2006. Neuroimaging studies have identified atypical activation patterns in area MTV5 during motion processing tasks and altered connectivity between motion processing regions and frontoparietal attentional networks. Robertson and Baron-Cohen, 2017. Research on autonomic function in ASD has demonstrated that many autistic individuals show baseline autonomic profiles characterized by elevated sympathetic tone, reduced parasympathetic activity, and lower heart rate variability, Benavides and Lane, 2015. This autonomic profile may create a greater physiological demand for self-regulatory strategies, which in turn may help explain why sensory-seeking behaviors are so prevalent in autistic populations. Shared mechanisms. Different contexts overlap between HSM and ASD sensory processing is best understood through the framework of shared mechanisms operating in different developmental and neurological contexts. Both may involve sustained engagement of the dorsal visual stream with motion variable stimuli. Both are associated with observable autonomic calming. Both appear to be automatically reinforced by the sensory regulatory outcome they produce. The critical distinction is scope. In ASD, visual motion fixation exists within a broader neurodevelopmental profile that includes differences in social communication, cognitive flexibility, and adaptive functioning. In HSM, as observed outside the context of ASD, the visual fixation behavior may occur without the broader profile. Beyond ASD, sensory processing across diagnostic categories of the implications of the HSM construct is that sensory regulatory fixation on visual motion may not be specific to any single diagnostic category. Clinically significant sensory processing differences have also been documented in ADHD, sensory processing disorder, Miller et al., 2007, developmental coordination disorder, anxiety disorders, PTSD, and intellectual disability. The possibility that HSM occurs across multiple diagnostic categories and in individuals with no diagnosis at all suggests that it may represent a fundamental feature of nervous system self-regulation rather than a symptom specific to any particular condition. This broader perspective is consistent with a dimensional rather than categorical understanding of sensory processing, one that is gaining traction in the research community. Chapter 9. The case study. Pay attention to what you see. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you, and still more will be added to you. Mark 4:24. This chapter presents the formal clinical case documentation for the two patients whose stories were introduced in chapters 2 and 3. The narrative voice of earlier chapters gives way here to the language of functional analysis and clinical outcome measurement. Patient E. Index Case Detail Identifier. E. Pseudonym. Age at observation. 6 years. Sex. Male. Diagnostic status. ASD diagnosis confirmed. Service setting. Home-based ABA services clinician. William Cormier, MS. 2 functionally related target behaviors were identified. Descriptive functional analysis indicated both were maintained by automatic reinforcement, automatic negative reinforcement, reduction of aversive arousal state through sensory-mediated autonomic regulation, and automatic positive reinforcement, production of preferred sensory stimulation. Neither behavior was maintained by social attention, escape, or tangible access. Intervention and outcome. A tablet with high-contrast video content was integrated into E's workspace during designated intervals and transition periods. The clinical rationale followed function-based intervention principles. If the behavior serves an automatic sensory regulatory function, eliminating it without alternative regulatory support would be expected to increase dysregulation. Outcomes were consistent with the functional hypothesis. Task engagement during structured work periods increased. Frequency of maladaptive behaviors during demand periods decreased. Escalation events during transitions were reduced. These outcomes suggest, though do not conclusively demonstrate, that the accommodation met a sensory regulatory need that, once satisfied, freed attentional and regulatory resources for task performance. Patient M. Supporting Case Detail Identifier. M. Pseudonym. Age at observation. 2 years, 6 months. Sex. Female. Service focus. Early skill building, communication, foundational social behaviors. Clinician. William Cormier, MSM. Demonstrated selective orientation toward fast-moving, high-contrast digital video content with observable physiological regulation during engagement. Her engagement was receptive rather than interactive, but the core functional profile was consistent with HSM. Preferential attention to high-velocity visual stimuli, rejection of below-threshold content, and measurable physiological calming during visual fixation. M's case suggests that the HSM pattern can present at a very early developmental stage, prior to the emergence of deliberate sensory-seeking strategies, and that the underlying regulatory mechanism may operate at a subcortical level independent of conscious intention. Chapter 10. The architecture of the scroll. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Proverbs 29:18. The preceding chapters established HyperSensory-Motofixation, HSM, as a clinical construct grounded in the neuroscience of visual processing and autonomic regulation. This chapter extends the analysis from the clinical to the cultural, examining how the sensory characteristics associated with HSM have been engineered, intentionally or not, into the dominant media platforms of the current era. Before proceeding, it is worth acknowledging that digital media, including video content, serves many legitimate and beneficial purposes. Educational content, therapeutic applications, social connection, creative expression, and assistive technology all represent positive dimensions of digital media use. The analysis that follows focuses specifically on the sensory processing implications of one particular media format and should not be read as a blanket indictment of screens or digital technology. The sensory profile of short-form video. Vertical short-form video platforms share a constellation of design features that, when analyzed through a sensory processing framework, align with the stimulus characteristics associated with HSM: high visual contrast, rapid scene transitions, dense information delivery within compressed time windows, full-field visual engagement on a vertically oriented screen, instantaneous transitions between content units with no neutral interval, and a primary interaction mechanism, the vertical swipe, that is itself a motor action producing an immediate visual velocity change. These features were designed to maximize engagement metrics through machine learning algorithms trained on billions of user interactions. Alter, 2017. The designers were solving an engineering problem: how to keep people watching. But the solution they arrived at converged on the same sensory formula associated with HSM: high velocity, high contrast, velocity variable visual stimulation with user-controlled speed modulation, variable ratio reinforcement, and dopaminergic engagement. Each swipe is a lever pull. Each video is a potential reward. The ratio of rewarding to non-rewarding content is unpredictable, creating a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, the schedule that behavioral research has identified as the most resistant to extinction. Montag et al., 2019. The neurochemical dimension is equally relevant. Variable ratio reinforcement drives dopaminergic activity in the mesolimbic system, particularly the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens. Schultz, 2016. The dopamine system responds most strongly not to the receipt of a reward, but to the anticipation of a reward whose probability is uncertain. Each swipe generates a brief spike of dopaminergic activity because the next video might be rewarding. When combined with the sensory processing dynamics described throughout this book, a dual pathway mechanism of sustained engagement emerges. The reward circuitry keeps the person swiping. The sensory processing circuitry keeps the person watching. They appear to reinforce each other, though this interaction has not been directly studied in the context of HSM and remains a theoretical proposal. The ITNLS hypothesis. This chapter introduces the induced transient neurodivergent-like state, ITNLS, hypothesis, that sustained engagement with vertical short-form video platforms may produce a temporary constellation of cognitive behavioral features in neurotypical individuals that phenomenologically overlap with characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. It is important to emphasize that ITNLS is a hypothesis requiring formal experimental validation, not an established finding. The proposed features of ITNLS include attentional narrowing, sensory fixation with growing preference for high-intensity visual input, repetitive motor-sensory engagement patterns, reduced social responsiveness during consumption, and difficulty transitioning away from the stimulus. Each feature has a plausible neurological mechanism grounded in established science. Attentional narrowing may result from sustained salience network activation with concurrent default mode suppression. Sensory fixation may reflect short-term threshold elevation in motion processing areas. Repetitive engagement may arise from the motor-sensory feedback loop operating through basal ganglia circuits. Reduced social responsiveness may reflect ventral vagal withdrawal. And transition difficulty may result from sensory mismatch between the platform's high-intensity visual environment and the lower-intensity ambient environment. What ITNLS is not autism. It is not a diagnosis. It is not a neurodevelopmental condition. It is proposed as a transient state that resolves upon cessation of the eliciting stimulus. It is environmentally dependent. It is narrow in scope, and it is reversible. The comparison to ASD is methodological, not diagnostic. The goal is to draw on the extensive neuroscience of autistic sensory processing to understand a potentially distinct phenomenon occurring in a broader population. Future controlled research is needed to determine whether ITNLS represents a valid and measurable construct, or whether the apparent overlap with ASD features is better explained by existing frameworks. Part 3. The digital question. What screens are doing to all of us. 11. The scroll and the child. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22:6. The sensory dynamics described in the previous chapter apply to all users of short-form video platforms. But children occupy a qualitatively different position because their brains are still developing, and the systems responsible for regulating sensory input and inhibiting automatic behavioral responses are among the last to mature. Casey, 2008. It is worth noting at the outset that not all screen-based content affects children in the same way. Some digital media is specifically designed to support developmental goals, and research has documented benefits of carefully designed educational content for young children. Linebarger and Walker, 2005. The concern addressed in this chapter is not screens in general, but the specific sensory architecture of high-velocity, algorithmically driven content, and its interaction with the developing nervous system, the developing brain and sensory vulnerability. The prefrontal cortex, which plays a central role in executive function, impulse control, and top-down attentional regulation, does not reach full structural and functional maturity until the mid-20s. Casey et al., 2008. In young children, prefrontal inhibitory control is limited, meaning the capacity to voluntarily disengage from a compelling sensory stimulus is fundamentally weaker than in adults. Simultaneously, the sensory processing systems are highly plastic in early development. The visual system is actively calibrating its thresholds and response characteristics based on the input it receives. This is the period of experience-dependent neural development, Huttenlocher, 2002, when the type and intensity of sensory experiences shape the architecture of the processing systems themselves. Research on the developing dorsal stream has shown that motion processing pathways mature on a timeline that may make young children particularly responsive to high-velocity visual input. Braddock, 2003. A child who receives extensive exposure to high-velocity, high-contrast visual content during this developmental window may be calibrating their visual processing system to expect and require that level of intensity. This possibility, while not yet empirically confirmed for HSM specifically, is consistent with established principles of experience-dependent neural plasticity and represents a question that longitudinal research should address. Distinguishing normal behavior from clinical patterns. Parents and educators face a genuine differential assessment challenge. A child who watches a screen intently could be engaging in developmentally normal visual exploration. The same presentation could indicate an emerging hypersensory-motofixation, HSM, pattern with a sensory regulatory function. Or it could reflect a temporary state produced by prolonged exposure to high-intensity content that will resolve with changes in screen access. Several clinical indicators help differentiate these possibilities. Duration and persistence. Does the pattern occur consistently across days and weeks, or does it resolve with changes in screen access? Cross-modal generalization. Does the child seek similar visual motion from non-digital sources, spinning objects, moving water, traffic, mechanical motion, weather patterns, or is the behavior specific to screens? Regulatory function. Are there observable physiological changes during engagement that suggest autonomic calming? Transition response. Does removal of the stimulus produce distress that seems disproportionate? And developmental trajectory. Is the pattern intensifying over time? An affirmative pattern across these indicators, particularly cross-modal generalization and observable regulatory function, points toward HSM rather than simple screen engagement. The presence of non-digital seeking behaviors is especially informative because it suggests the underlying sensory need exists independently of the technology. Neurodivergent children in the digital landscape for children already on the autism spectrum or with other sensory processing differences. The interaction between their existing sensory profile and digital media architecture is especially consequential. These children often arrive at the screen with elevated sensory thresholds already in place, and the platform delivers exactly the intensity of input their nervous systems are seeking. This creates a genuine clinical tension. The content appears to provide real regulatory benefit. Removing it without alternative accommodation is likely to produce dysregulation. But the platform's reinforcement architecture sustains engagement beyond the point of regulatory need, and the sensory intensity may be influencing thresholds over time. The clinician's task is to preserve the apparent regulatory benefit while managing the risks, which requires the kind of functional understanding that the HSM construct is designed to provide. Part 4. Clinical Practice. What to do with what we now know. Chapter 12. Recognizing HSM in the field. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. Proverbs 9. Science that remains in a book does not help the children in front of us. This chapter translates the theoretical framework into clinical practice. How to identify hypersensory-motofixation, HSM, how to assess its function, and how to differentiate it from related presentations. 5 behavioral indicators. HSM reveals itself through a convergent pattern of behaviors. No single indicator is diagnostic in isolation. The construct is identified when multiple indicators are present simultaneously. First, sustained visual fixation on moving stimuli with preferential attention to velocity transitions. The child locks on to motion in a way that is disproportionate to the apparent interest value of the stimulus and persists in the face of competing demands. Attention concentrates most intensely during moments of acceleration, deceleration, or directional change. Second, observable physiological calming during the fixation. Slowed breathing, reduced muscle tension, particularly in the shoulders, jaw, and forehead, softening of facial expression. This is the feature that separates HSM from simple distraction. Third, active sensory seeking. The child does not passively encounter these stimuli. They pursue them. They position themselves near rotating objects, moving machinery, or windows with active views. They seek screens. They request specific content. If capable, they manipulate playback speed. Fourth, content indifference paired with motion preference. The child does not care about narrative, characters, or subject matter. They care about visual speed, contrast, and transition rate. Maintaining the motion profile while changing the content preserves engagement. Maintaining the content while reducing the motion eliminates it. Fifth, disproportionate distress upon stimulus removal. When the visual motion source is interrupted, the child shows arousal, agitation, or distress beyond what the loss of a preferred activity would typically produce. This suggests the stimulus was serving a regulatory function, and its removal has disrupted autonomic equilibrium. Functional Assessment Protocol confirming HSM requires functional assessment establishing automatic sensory regulatory reinforcement as the maintaining variable. The standard ABA functional assessment framework applies. Bijou, 1968. Iwata, 1982-1994. Observe the behavior across conditions. Alone, with familiar adults during demands, during free time, in high stimulation versus low stimulation environments. If the behavior occurs consistently across these conditions with the same topography and observable regulatory effect, automatic reinforcement is strongly indicated. Key differential considerations include social attention. Does the behavior increase when observed? Escape. Does it occur exclusively during demands? And tangible access. Is it maintained by the external reward of screen time rather than the sensory experience itself? HSM. The answer to all three should be no. The digital consumption sensory interview, because HSM frequently involves digital media. A structured assessment of media use through a sensory processing lens should be part of any evaluation. Key domains to assess: the visual profile of preferred content, whether the individual manipulates playback speed, whether preferred content shares a consistent sensory signature regardless of subject matter, how physiological and behavioral presentation changes during and after consumption, difficulty transitioning away from preferred content, and whether similar visual motion seeking occurs with non-digital stimuli. Chapter 13. Working with HSM, not against it. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. Galatians 69. When a behavior serves an automatic sensory regulatory function, the most effective clinical approach works with the behavior rather than against it. This chapter outlines intervention principles, environmental design strategies, and the clinical judgment required to determine when accommodation is sufficient and when further evaluation is indicated. Function-based intervention principles. The core principle is that suppressing a behavior without addressing its function does not eliminate the need. Iwata, 1982-1994. It forces the individual to find another way to meet that need, and the alternative may be less adaptive, less safe, or more disruptive. If HyperSensory-Motofixation, HSM, is maintaining autonomic regulation, removing access to the regulatory stimulus without providing an alternative will predictably increase dysregulation. The clinical question shifts from how do I stop this to how do I meet this sensory need in a way that is compatible with the child's other goals. With E, the answer was structured tablet access during designated intervals and transitions. The accommodation did not create screen dependence. It appeared to reduce it by meeting the sensory need proactively, which freed the child's regulatory resources for task engagement during demand periods. Environmental design digital media is one way to deliver HSM-compatible visual stimulation, but it is not the only way. Thoughtful environmental design can provide motion-rich visual input without the variable ratio reinforcement architecture of screen-based platforms. Options include adjustable speed desk fans, liquid motion timers, lava lamps, kinetic sculptures, Newton's cradles, fish tanks, and window seats overlooking traffic or moving water. Non-digital accommodations have a significant advantage. They provide the sensory input without the dopaminergic engagement cycle of algorithmic content delivery. The child receives the apparent regulatory benefit of visual motion fixation without the behavioral hook that makes screen-based engagement self-perpetuating. Neurodiversity-affirming framework HSM-informed intervention aligns with neurodiversity-affirming clinical practice. CAP, 2020. The child who tracks the spin cycle of a washing machine is not broken. The child who fast-forwards video to create velocity transitions is not misbehaving. The teenager who cannot stop watching rain run down a car window is not wasting time. These individuals have nervous systems that require specific sensory input to achieve regulatory balance, and they have found creative ways to obtain it. When to be concerned, further evaluation is warranted when the behavior significantly interferes with daily functioning despite reasonable accommodations, when sensory thresholds appear to be escalating, requiring progressively more intense stimulation, when the behavior is accompanied by indicators of broader neurodevelopmental difference not yet formally assessed, or when the fixation produces distress rather than calm. In these cases, referral for comprehensive evaluation is indicated. HSM is a descriptive construct, not a diagnosis. Chapter 14. Digital Hygiene and the Nervous System So Teach Us to Number Our Days That We May Get a Heart of Wisdom. 9012. This chapter speaks to everyone who uses a screen. The principles of sensory processing that underlie HyperSensory-Motofixation, HSM, and the induced transient neurodivergent-like state, ITNLS, hypothesis are not confined to clinical populations. They operate in every nervous system, and understanding them allows anyone to make more informed choices about their relationship with digital media. It should be emphasized that the ITNLS concept remains a hypothesis awaiting controlled experimental validation. The observations described below are based on clinical experience and self-monitoring, not on controlled studies. They are offered as a framework for informed self-awareness, not as established clinical guidance. Recognizing your own ITNLS. The transition from active media consumption to passive sensory entrainment is the boundary that matters. It is the moment when swiping stops being a choice and becomes an automatic motor sensory loop. Learning to notice that transition is the single most important step toward informed engagement. The aftereffects are equally worth noticing. When you stop scrolling, the world may briefly feel too slow, too quiet, too visually sparse. You may feel restless or unable to settle into a non-digital task. These are not character flaws. They may be sensory recalibration effects. Your visual processing system temporarily adjusted its threshold for what constitutes adequate stimulation, and the physical environment is not meeting that threshold yet. The recovery window sensory recalibration after sustained short-form video engagement appears to be dose-dependent based on informal clinical observation. Brief sessions appear to produce minimal aftereffect. Sessions of 30 to 60 minutes are associated with a noticeable transition period. Sessions exceeding an hour may produce effects that persist for a significant portion of the following hours. These observations point toward a dose-response relationship that formal research should investigate using objective measures such as attentional performance tasks, pupillometry, and heart rate variability monitoring. Practical strategies. The goal is not abstinence. It is informed engagement. Build transition buffers into media use. A few minutes of non-digital visual engagement between scrolling and cognitive work. Notice the swipe reflex, the moment when swiping transitions from deliberate to automatic, and use that awareness as a decision point. Vary your visual diet. Balance high-velocity digital content with slower, deeper, three-dimensional visual environments. And for parents, differentiate between types of screen content based on their sensory profile, not just their duration. A slow-paced documentary and a rapid-fire short-form video feed are not neurologically equivalent, even if they occupy the same number of minutes. Part 5. The Road Ahead, Where This Work Goes From Here. Chapter 15. The dissertation and beyond for which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it. 1428A book introduces ideas. Research establishes them. This chapter outlines the empirical agenda required to move hypersensory-motofixation, HSM, from a clinical observation supported by a theoretical framework into a validated construct with peer-reviewed evidence. The dissertation, my graduate dissertation at Liberty University, will represent the first formal empirical investigation of HSM. The study will operationally define the construct in measurable behavioral terms, establish inter-rater reliability for HSM identification, and test the hypothesis that velocity variable visual fixation is associated with measurable autonomic shifts consistent with parasympathetic activation. The proposed methodology employs a single-subject ABAB reversal design, Kasdan, 2011, which is well-suited to documenting functional relationships in clinical behavioral research. In the baseline phases, the participant engages in typical activities without access to velocity-variable visual stimuli. In the B intervention phases, structured access to HSM-compatible stimuli is provided. If the hypothesized regulatory function is genuine, physiological indicators should shift toward parasympathetic calm during B phases and return toward baseline during A phases. The reversal design allows each participant to serve as their own control, strengthening causal inference, despite the small sample sizes typical of clinical behavioral research. Concurrent heart rate variability, HRV, monitoring via wearable sensors will provide the objective psychophysiological data that the preliminary clinical observations described in this book lack. Portable HRV monitors, such as Polar H10 chest straps paired with research-grade software, can capture beat-to-beat cardiac data with sufficient resolution to detect shifts between sympathetic and parasympathetic dominance during HSM engagement periods. Respiratory rate and electrodermal activity may be recorded as secondary physiological measures. Inter-observer agreement, IOA, will be established for all behavioral coding. 2 trained observers will independently code video-recorded sessions for the presence and duration of HSM target behaviors using the operational definitions developed for the study. IOA will be calculated on a minimum of 30% of sessions, with an agreement threshold of 80% or higher required for inclusion. Participant criteria will include children currently receiving ABA services who demonstrate at least 3 of the 5 HSM behavioral indicators described in Chapter 12, as confirmed by independent observation. Both neurodivergent and neurotypical participants will be sought to assess HSM across diagnostic categories. Neuroimaging research priorities beyond the dissertation. The most important next step is neuroimaging research. 3 questions are most pressing. First, does velocity variable visual motion produce a distinctive activation pattern in the dorsal visual stream that differs from constant speed motion? Functional MRI with parametrically varied motion stimuli can answer this. Second, does visual motion fixation during HSM-type engagement produce cortical oscillation patterns consistent with neural entrainment, and do those patterns correlate with autonomic calming? EEG with simultaneous HRV monitoring can test this, and a particularly promising paradigm is steady-state visual evoked potentials, SSVEPs, which can isolate the magnocellular contribution to visual processing by measuring the brain's electrical response to rhythmic visual stimulation at specific frequencies. Norsha, 2015. SSVEP methodology has already been used to document atypical temporal processing in ASD populations, Milne, 2009, and could reveal whether individuals who demonstrate HSM show a distinctive magnocellular response profile. Third, do neural activation patterns during HSM overlap with the atypical visual motion processing profiles documented in ASD research? This research requires collaboration with neuroimaging laboratories and neuroscience faculty beyond the scope of a single graduate program. But the questions are testable, the methodology exists, and the findings would have direct implications for clinical practice. Developing an HSM assessment instrument. Clinical adoption of the HSM construct requires a standardized assessment tool accessible to clinicians beyond the ABA community. A screening instrument capturing the 5 core behavioral indicators and differentiating HSM from related constructs is a priority for the next phase of this work. Validation will require testing across multiple clinical populations, age groups, and diagnostic categories to establish sensitivity, specificity, and discriminant validity. Longitudinal questions. Several questions require longitudinal investigation. Does chronic exposure to HSM-compatible digital media alter sensory processing thresholds over time? Is there a critical developmental window during which the effects are most pronounced? Do children who demonstrate HSM early in development show a different sensory processing trajectory than those who do not? These questions cannot be answered by a single study. They require sustained research programs with cohort tracking over years, a call to collaborate. The evidence base for HSM will not be built by one researcher. It requires visual neuroscientists, sensory processing researchers, developmental psychologists, occupational therapists, behavior analysts, technology ethicists, and clinicians working with diverse populations. If the pattern described in this book is recognizable in your practice, in your research, or in your own experience, the invitation is open. Document what you see. Apply the framework. Share your findings. The science advances when observation becomes collaborative. Chapter 16. A new term for a new problem. Everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Ecclesiastes 3. One language shapes perception. When you have a word for something, you notice it more readily, remember it more clearly, and respond to it more effectively. When the word does not exist, the phenomenon persists, but it lives in the margins of awareness, unnamed and unexamined. For decades, the behaviors described in this book existed without a name. Children fixated on spinning objects and clinicians redirected them. A man rewound VHS tapes until they fell apart and his family shrugged. Teenagers scrolled for hours and parents took their phones. Adults lost evenings to short-form video and blamed themselves. In every case, something was happening at the level of the nervous system that went unrecognized. No term existed to say, this is not distraction, this is not addiction, this is not a character flaw. This is a nervous system seeking the specific sensory input it needs to regulate, and it deserves to be understood on those terms. HyperSensory-Motofixation is that term. The responsibility of platforms if future research supports the ITNLS hypothesis. The implications extend beyond clinical practice into corporate responsibility and public policy. Technology companies have created products whose sensory architectures may be associated with temporary neurological shifts in hundreds of millions of users. The conversation about social media and mental health has been dominated by discussions of content. But the sensory architecture of the medium itself, the speed, the contrast, the reinforcement schedule, the velocity dynamics, may be producing effects that are independent of content. Understanding those effects is a shared responsibility. Toward an integrated science, this book has been written from the intersection of applied behavior analysis, clinical mental health counseling, and neuroscience. Each discipline contributed something essential. ABA provided the functional lens. Clinical mental health provided the experiential depth. Neuroscience provided the mechanistic framework. None alone could have produced the construct that all three together yielded. Hypersensory-Motofixation exists at this intersection because the phenomenon itself does. Understanding it fully requires integrated science, and building that integration is the work that lies ahead. Closing. This book began with two men in a living room who never knew they were teaching anyone anything. It moves through clinical observations that gave the pattern a name, through the neuroscience that explains why the pattern works the way it does, and through the cultural question of what happens when the sensory formula behind that pattern gets engineered into a technology platform and delivered to hundreds of millions of people. The children and adults who live with this pattern of sensory processing deserve to be met with curiosity and accommodation rather than confusion and correction. This book is the beginning of that shift. The dissertation will advance it. The research that follows will establish it. And the term itself will give clinicians, educators, researchers, and families a shared language for something that has always been with us but has never, until now, had a name. This is where the science begins. Glossary of Key Terms, MTV5. A region in the dorsal visual stream of the brain that contains neurons specifically tuned to detect the direction and speed of visual motion. Named MT for middle temporal area. Central to the neural processing relevant to HSM automatic reinforcement. In applied behavior analysis, reinforcement that is produced directly by the behavior itself rather than mediated by another person. HSM behaviors appear to be automatically reinforced by the sensory input and autonomic calming they produce. Autonomic nervous system, ANS. The division of the nervous system that controls involuntary body functions including heart rate, breathing, digestion, and the stress response. Consists of sympathetic activating and parasympathetic calming branches. Default mode network. A network of brain regions that is active during rest, mind-wandering, and self-referential thought. Sustained external visual fixation may suppress default mode activity, contributing to the focused calm observed in HSM dorsal visual stream, one of two major visual processing pathways in the brain. Flows from the primary visual cortex into the parietal lobe and specializes in processing motion, spatial relationships, and the temporal dynamics of visual input, sometimes called the where or how pathway. Functional analysis. A systematic method in applied behavior analysis for identifying the purpose, function. A behavior serves by examining the relationships between antecedents, the behavior itself, and its consequences. Heart rate variability, HRV. The variation in time intervals between successive heartbeats. Higher HRV generally indicates more flexible, adaptive autonomic regulation with stronger vagal tone. Proposed as an objective biomarker for future HSM research. Endogenous opioid system. The body's internal system of opioid peptides and receptors involved in pain modulation, reward, and the consummatory phase of pleasure. Distinguished from dopamine-driven wanting. The opioid system mediates liking and satiation. May play a role in the calming dimension of HSM, as distinct from the seeking behavior driven by dopamine in digital media engagement. HyperSensory-Motofixation, HSM. The construct introduced in this book, a pattern of sustained, preferential, and functionally regulatory visual attention directed towards stimuli characterized by velocity variable motion, high contrast, and rhythmic dynamics. Proposed as serving an autonomic self-regulatory function. Induced transient neurodivergent-like state, ITNLS. A hypothesis proposed in this book suggesting that sustained engagement with vertical short-form video platforms may produce temporary cognitive behavioral features in neurotypical individuals that overlap with characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. Requires formal experimental validation. Magnocellular pathway. One of two parallel visual processing channels originating at the retina. Carries information about contrast, motion, and rapid temporal changes at high speed. Feeds preferentially into the dorsal stream and area MT. Neural adaptation. The tendency of neurons to reduce their firing rate in response to constant, unchanging stimulation, and to reactivate when the stimulus changes. Explains why velocity transitions produce stronger neural engagement than constant speed motion. Neural entrainment. A phenomenon in which rhythmic external stimulation synchronizes the brain's intrinsic oscillatory activity. Visual flicker at specific frequencies can entrain cortical oscillations with downstream effects on arousal and attention. Neurosption. A term from Stephen Porges. Polyvagal theory describing the nervous system's unconscious process of scanning the environment for cues of safety or danger. May explain why rhythmic visual motion appears to promote autonomic calming in HSM. Optokinetic reflex, OKR. An involuntary eye movement response triggered by large-field visual motion. Produces optokinetic nystagmus, a rhythmic cycle of slow tracking movements followed by rapid resets, closely integrated with the vestibular system. may play a role in HSM by providing a rhythmic vestibular-ocular engagement cycle during visual motion fixation. Parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest branch of the autonomic nervous system, slows heart rate, deepens breathing, relaxes muscles. The physiological calming observed in HSM appears consistent with parasympathetic activation. Polyvagal theory, a theory developed by Stephen Porges proposing that the autonomic nervous system has three hierarchical response states: ventral vagal social engagement, sympathetic mobilization, dorsal vagal immobilization, rather than two. Restricted and repetitive behaviors, RRBs, one of two core diagnostic domains for autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5-TR, includes stereotyped movements, insistence on sameness, fixated interest, and hyperreactivity to sensory input, sensation seeking. In Dunn's sensory processing model, a profile characterized by high neurological thresholds and active behavioral responses, individuals actively pursue intense sensory experiences to reach optimal arousal. Sensory processing, the neurological process of receiving, organizing, and interpreting sensory information from the environment and the body. Individual differences in sensory processing affect how people respond to and seek out sensory experiences. Steady-state visual evoked potentials, SSVEPs, an EEG-based measurement technique that records the brain's electrical response to rhythmic visual stimulation at specific frequencies. Because it can isolate the magnocellular pathway's contribution to visual processing, SSVEP methodology is proposed as a tool for future HSM research to determine whether individuals demonstrating HSM show distinctive temporal processing profiles. Sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight branch of the autonomic nervous system, increases heart rate, quickens breathing, tenses muscles, prepares the body for action. Variable ratio reinforcement schedule, a reinforcement schedule in which a reward is delivered after an unpredictable number of responses, produces high, persistent response rates and is resistant to extinction. The schedule underlying algorithmic content delivery in short-form video platforms. Velocity transitions, moments when visual motion changes speed, either accelerating or decelerating, proposed as the critical stimulus feature in HSM, as they reactivate motion-sensitive neurons that would otherwise habituate to constant speed motion. Ventral vagal complex. In polyvagal theory, the newest evolutionary branch of the vagal nerve that supports states of calm alertness, social engagement, and flexible autonomic regulation. Ventral visual stream, the second major visual processing pathway flowing from primary visual cortex into the temporal lobe, specializes in object recognition, face identification, and color processing, sometimes called the what pathway. About the author William Cormier is a registered behavior technician, RBT, and graduate student in the clinical mental health counseling program at the School of Behavioral Sciences, Liberty University. He holds a Master of Science in Curriculum and Instruction and plans to pursue a Ph.D. in counselor education and supervision following completion of his current program. His clinical work spans applied behavior analysis, clinical mental health, and neuroscience, with a particular focus on the intersection of sensory processing, self-regulation, and neurodivergent experience. He has worked with children across multiple home-based and clinical ABA settings, and it was through this direct clinical practice that he identified the behavioral pattern he calls HyperSensory-Motofixation. William grew up in a household with two adopted uncles who had intellectual disabilities, an experience that shaped his understanding of neurodevelopmental difference long before he entered the clinical field. He credits Richard and Larry with showing him, decades before he had the training to understand it, that the way a person interacts with sensory stimulation is never meaningless. The HSM construct will be the subject of his doctoral dissertation and the foundation of a broader research program he intends to develop throughout his doctoral studies and academic career. He welcomes correspondence from clinicians, researchers, educators, and families. References are included in the printed edition. Contact information is available through Liberty University.